There is a record buried in the Galactic Accord's oldest archives that no ambassador is allowed to read during their first year of service. Not because it is classified, not because it is dangerous, but because every single diplomat who has read it in their first year has immediately submitted a resignation letter, packed their bags, and gone home to whatever quiet corner of the galaxy they came from and never spoken of the stars again. The record is 7 words long. 7 words stamped in a universal script filed under the category Planetary Threat Assessment, Class Undefined. Do not wake the two-legged storm. Asterisk no coordinates. No species name. No explanation of what the storm was, what it had done, or why it had earned that particular title instead of the dozens of other classifications the Accord used for dangerous civilizations. Predator class, hive mind alert, expansion risk, chemical hazard. Just that. 7 words. And a footnote. The footnote was added 3,000 years after the original warning by a cartographer who had stumbled onto the record while cataloging dead systems. She had added only 1 line in small text, almost as an afterthought. The planet is still there. The storm is still sleeping. Leave it alone. Asterisk she had retired the following week. 3,000 years passed. Then, the Velhari Dominion found the blue planet. And they landed anyway. What happened next was not a war. Wars have 2 sides. Wars have strategy and retreat and negotiation tables and someone eventually waving a white flag. What happened next did not have any of those things. What happened next had a name, but the Velhari survivors, the 17 of them, out of a fleet of 40,000, refused to say it aloud for the rest of their lives. They only ever called it. The week we learned what the Oracle meant. This is that story, told from the beginning. So you understand exactly how badly they did not listen. The Velhari Dominion had never been wrong before. That was the problem. 3,000 years of expansion across 47 star systems, absorbing 12 civilizations, dissolving 8 more through economic strangulation alone, and not once had they miscalculated badly enough to regret it. Caution was a concept they had studied, understood, and then quietly set aside the way you set aside a child's toy, with affection for what it once was, but zero intention of picking it back up. High Commander Sareth Volume 50 stood on the observation deck of the flagship Eternal Dominion and looked at the blue planet through the viewport glass and felt nothing but appetite. It was beautiful in a way that unclaimed things were always beautiful. Swirled with white cloud systems, patched with deep oceans, green and brown land masses scattered across it like someone had dropped a handful of paint on a spinning ball and just let it go. It sat in its star's habitable zone with the smug contentment of a planet that had never been touched by anything more sophisticated than its own weather. Untouched, unclaimed, theirs for the taking. Resource Assessment, Volume 50 said, not turning from the viewport. Subcommander Drea Kell pulled up her data slate and read in the flat, efficient tone she used for briefings. Atmospheric composition breathable by Velhari biology with minor filter adjustment. Fresh water in enormous surface quantities. Soil mineral content rich enough to make their agrochemical divisions weep with gratitude. Fossil fuel deposits in the billions of standard units, barely scratched. Rare earth metals in concentrations that didn't make geological sense, as if the planet had been specifically designed to be valuable. Indigenous population? Volume 50 asked. Kell paused, just for a half-second. The kind of pause that carried information without words. 1 species. Bipedal. Class 3 intelligence rating on the Accord scale. Volume 50 turned from the viewport. Class 3. Yes, Commander. Class 3 meant tool users. Primitive space awareness. Maybe pre-interstellar. The kind of species that looked at the night sky and wrote poetry about it instead of building ships to get there. The Velhari had absorbed 8 Class 3 civilizations without breaking a sweat. 2 of them had welcomed the integration once they understood the resource trade. 3 had needed encouragement. 3 had needed to be replaced entirely by more cooperative populations, which was a bureaucratic inconvenience, but not a military one. Population count? Approximately 8 billion, concentrated in surface settlements. No orbital infrastructure, no energy shields, no FDL signatures of any kind. Kel hesitated again. They do appear to have some form of nuclear capability. Class 3 with nuclear. Yes, sir. Primitive delivery systems. Ground-based mostly. Some submarine platforms we've detected. Volume 50 almost laughed. Almost. He was too dignified for almost. Nuclear weapons in the hands of a Class 3 species were the military equivalent of a child throwing rocks at a battle cruiser. Messy, potentially annoying if you weren't paying attention, but fundamentally the concern of something that hadn't yet understood the gap between what it was and what was coming. Send the standard integration package, he said, turning back to the viewport. Frequency broadcast. Universal Translation Protocol. Give them 48 hours to respond with submission confirmation. If they don't respond, we move to Phase 2. Kel was quiet for a moment. Commander, there's one other thing. He waited. The Galactic Accord archive flag. When we filed the approach route, we received an automated flag on the target system. Old record. Pre-Accord, actually. She seemed uncertain how to continue. A warning. Warnings from pre-Accord civilizations are archaeological curiosities, Subcommander, not operational intelligence. Yes, sir. Of course. Another pause. It just seemed unusual. The language was specific. He looked at her. She read from her slate. Do not wake the two-legged storm. Volume 50 stared at the planet for a long time. Two-legged, he said. Yes, sir. He looked at the bipedal creatures visible in the long-range magnification feed. Small, fleshy, no exoskeleton, no natural armor plating, no bioelectric field, no venom apparatus detected. They moved around on the surface in their primitive wheeled vehicles, constructing things out of metal and concrete, making noise on their radio frequencies, completely unaware that 40,000 ships were watching them from orbit. Two-legged. This soft, fragile, technically nuclear but basically rock-throwing species. The storm. He laughed. This time he actually did. Send the broadcast, he said. The broadcast reached Earth on a Tuesday, which was not a particularly notable day for most of the planet, but became, within approximately 4 hours of the signal's arrival, the most notable Tuesday in the recorded history of human civilization. The signal came in on frequencies that human equipment wasn't built to receive. It shouldn't have been detectable at all. But the array at a research station in the Chilean highlands picked it up anyway. Not because the equipment was good enough, but because one of the junior astronomers had been running an unofficial experimental modification on the receiver array for 3 months, trying to detect a specific type of cosmic background radiation for his thesis, and his modification made the array sensitive to exactly the wrong frequencies at exactly the right time. His name was Dr. Tomas Rendon, and he would later describe the moment of detection as the worst thing that ever happened to me personally and the second most important moment in human history. And I will never stop being angry about the order of those two facts. The signal wasn't hard to decode. It was designed not to be. Universal Translation Protocol, the Velhari called it, a mathematical framework built on physical constants and prime number sequences that any species intelligent enough to use tools would eventually be able to parse. It took human cryptographers, computational linguists, and 3 AI systems working in parallel approximately 11 hours to crack the outer shell of the translation matrix. The message itself took another 6 hours to render into human language. Then, it sat in a classified terminal in a Geneva basement for 4 more hours while 17 different people argued about who had the authority to decide what to do with it. The message, once fully translated, read, "Greetings from the Velhari Dominion. Your world has been assessed for integration into the Dominion's resource network. You are invited to confirm peaceful submission within 48 hours. Submission includes transfer of territorial sovereignty, resource access rights, and population labor agreements to be determined upon arrival of administrative units. Failure to confirm will result in accelerated integration procedures. We look forward to your cooperation." Asterisk, the person who finally made the decision about what to do with it was not a head of state, not a general, not a secretary general of the United Nations. It was a 63-year-old woman named Dr. Yael Ofer, the director of the First Contact Protocol Division, a department that had been created 40 years ago, widely mocked, barely funded, and staffed mostly by people who other departments hadn't known what to do with. Dr. Ofer read the message once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, doing what her staff had come to call the calculation. The particular quality of silence she entered when she was working something out in her head that she didn't want to say out loud until she was certain. Then she picked up the phone and made one call. "Give me the Security Council," she said, "and someone wake up the Americans. Tell them to bring their military people. All of them." A junior staffer leaned in. "Should we respond to the signal, Dr. Ofer?" They gave a 48-hour window. "No," she said. "We don't respond to the signal." "Why not?" She looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a person who had not yet understood the room they were standing in. "Because responding is what they're expecting," she said. "Submission or defiance. Both of those are legible to them. Both give them a framework. We don't give them a framework. So what do we give them?" She was already walking toward the door. 48 hours, she said. What happened in those 48 hours was not, technically, a war plan. It was something more difficult and more dangerous than a war plan. A war plan assumed you knew the shape of the enemy. It assumed there was a shape. It assumed recognizable parameters, fleet size, weapon range, energy output, strategic objectives. What Dr. Ofer's team assembled in 48 hours was something with no name in the Velhari tactical vocabulary. It had no name in most human tactical vocabulary either. The closest thing any of the participating generals could call it, when pressed, was a controlled disaster designed to teach something. They pulled in people from places that military planners don't usually pull from. Behavioral economists, primatologists, game theorists, a historian of asymmetric warfare who hadn't been asked to consult on anything in 11 years and showed up to the briefing room still confused about whether this was a real meeting. A woman who had spent 30 years studying how ant colonies respond to invasive species. A man who had written his dissertation on how human immune systems developed to treat unknown pathogens. Not destroy them immediately, but confuse them. Make the environment hostile in ways the pathogen had never encountered and, therefore, had no defensive script for. That last one got everyone very quiet. The problem with facing a Class 3 species, Dr. Ofer said, standing at the head of the table at hour 32, running on black coffee, and whatever biological stubbornness had gotten her this far in life, is that you already know how to fight them. You've done it before. You have protocols. You have expected response trees. Submission, defiance, guerrilla resistance, nuclear bluff. You've seen all of it. She paused. Let that sit. So we don't do any of those things. A general from the American contingent, 4 stars, the kind of face that had spent 40 years not showing what it was thinking, leaned forward. "What do? We do things they don't have a word for yet," she said. The 48 hours ran out. No response was sent. The Velhari, slightly confused but professionally unworried, moved to Phase 2. High Commander Volume 50 watched the first landing units deploy with the detached satisfaction of a man supervising a task he had done 30 times before. 40,000 ships in orbit. 5,000 ground units descending in the first wave. Heavy armored transports, atmospheric fighters, mobile command centers, administrative processing units. The full integration package, scaled for a Class 3 resistance that was almost certainly going to be minimal, possibly non-existent once the ground unit's firepower became apparent. Kel stood beside him at the viewport. "Still no response to the broadcast," she said. "Doesn't matter. Phase 2 doesn't require a response." "No, sir." She was quiet. He didn't look at her, but he'd worked with Drakel for 11 years, and he could read her silences the way other people read text. "Something is bothering you," he said. "The archive warning," she said. "I know it's pre-accord. I know it's archaeological. But I keep thinking about the language. Do not wake, not do not engage, not do not conquer. Wake." Volume 50 watched the landing units breach the upper atmosphere. "Sleep is a state of temporary reduced capacity," he said. "Whatever the two-legged storm was 3,000 years ago, It has been sleeping for 3,000 years. Anything that sleeps that long has lost whatever made it worth warning about. Yes, sir. The first landing units touched down. Kel's comm unit lit up 3 minutes later. Then 7 more. Then 20. Then the entire board. Not weapons fire. The sensors would have shown weapons fire. Something else. Something the sensors were struggling to categorize because it wasn't behaving like any contact profile in the database. The ground units were reporting. What? Environmental interference? Indigenous vehicle activity? Some kind of acoustic disruption? Volume 50 stepped to the sensor console. The planet below looked exactly the same from orbit. Blue and white and green and peaceful. He pulled up the first ground unit's visual feed. It took him 30 full seconds to understand what he was looking at. Not because the image was unclear, because what the image was showing him was not in any tactical document he had ever read, and his brain was performing the laborious process of building a new category from scratch. The ground. The ground around the landing site was moving, not the ground itself. The things on the ground. Thousands of them. Hundreds of thousands. The two-legged creatures, moving toward the landing sites from every direction, in every type of vehicle their primitive infrastructure could produce, but also on foot, on bicycles, on horses in some regions, and they weren't running away. They were coming toward the ships, not charging, not attacking, not in military formation. They were carrying things, signs, cameras, recording equipment. Some of them were singing. Volume 50 could see the sound wave patterns in the audio sensors without being able to translate the specific language. But the pattern wasn't distress. It wasn't even anger. It was something else. Something his translation matrix kept rendering as spectacle, as performance, as showing up on purpose to be witnessed. He didn't understand it. He flagged it as anomalous and kept watching. The two-legged creatures surrounded the landing sites. Every single one. Within 6 hours of first touchdown, every landing zone on the planet's surface was encircled. Not by armies, by populations, civilians, who had apparently looked at the arrival of an alien invasion force and decided that what the moment called for was to go there and watch, and record, and sing. Volume 50 pulled up the comm, Ground Unit 7. What is your status? The unit commander's voice came back tightly controlled in the way that voices got when the person speaking was doing active work to remain tightly controlled. We are surrounded, sir. No weapons drawn. No aggressive movement. They are looking at us. What are they doing? Mostly filming, sir. I think they're taking photographs. Of us. A pause. Some of them have brought food. They appear to be eating while they watch. Volume 50 stared at the viewport. Below him, on a blue planet that had never been touched by any interstellar civilization in 3,000 years, 8 billion two-legged creatures that an ancient oracle had considered worth naming looked at 40,000 ships dropping from the sky and did not run, did not cower, did not submit, did not even reach for their nuclear weapons. They brought snacks, and they watched. He heard Kel's voice behind him, very quiet. Do not wake the storm, sir. He didn't answer her. He was beginning to understand that the archive was not describing what the storm had done 3,000 years ago. It was describing what the storm always did, what was constitutionally, biologically, categorically built to do when poked. He was beginning to understand that the sleeping had been the peaceful part, and the waking had just started. The Velhari had a word for the period between first contact and full integration. They called it Velsora, which translated loosely as the softening. It was the phase during which the target civilization processed the reality of the Dominion's arrival, cycled through its predictable emotional stages, denial, resistance, calculation, collapse, and arrived, usually within 2 to 6 weeks, at the only logical conclusion. Cooperation with the new order was preferable to the alternative. Velsora Asterisk had never failed. 31 integrations. 31 softening phases. The timeline varied, the degree of early resistance varied, but the destination was always the same. High Commander Volume 50 did not know yet that his 32nd was going to be different. He suspected it. The suspicion sat in the back of his chest like a stone he hadn't decided what to do with. But suspicion was not data, and Volume 50 was a man who required data before he changed course. He was getting data now, more than he wanted. The first week of ground occupation was not, technically, a failure. Nothing had blown up. His units were still functional. The two-legged creatures were not attacking. By every conventional metric, Phase 2 was proceeding within acceptable parameters. But something was wrong with the texture of it. The crowds that had gathered at the landing sites on day 1 had not dispersed. They had organized. That was the word that kept appearing in his ground commander's reports, delivered each time with the particular flatness of someone trying not to sound alarmed. The local population has organized. It meant different things in different landing zones. In the northern continental region, it meant the creatures had set up what appeared to be a permanent monitoring station staffed in rotating shifts, watching the Velhari ground units 24 hours a day, documenting everything, passing information to each other through their primitive communication networks with a speed that defied Vol's expectations of Class 3 infrastructure. In the southern coastal zones, it meant they had built. He stared at the report for a long time before he accepted it. Supply chains, bringing food and water to the people doing the watching. Organized delivery, volunteer labor. A logistics operation assembled in 72 hours out of nothing, but the peculiar collaborative efficiency of creatures who had apparently evolved to build things together under pressure. Everywhere, they were recording. Every Velhari unit movement, every ship in orbit, every supply drone that crossed the sky. They pointed their recording devices up at the atmosphere and captured footage of the fleet with instruments that shouldn't have been able to resolve images at that distance, and somehow did because the two-legged creatures had, in the space of 1 week, collectively modified their equipment to make it work better for the specific purpose of watching something they hadn't been watching a week ago. And they were sharing everything with each other. Instantly, the planet had a global communication network, primitive technically, but absurdly comprehensive. Every creature with a small personal device was connected to every other creature with a small personal device, and information moved through that network at speeds that made Velhari intelligence officers uncomfortable when they mapped it. One thing happened on the eastern landmass, and within 4 minutes the western landmass knew, and within 6 minutes someone on the western landmass had written 3 analytical documents about it, and within another 20 minutes those documents had been read, argued about, corrected, and synthesized by what appeared to be thousands of individuals working in parallel. The Velhari Intelligence Division's best estimate put the number of creatures actively working on understanding Velhari technology, communication patterns, and behavioral signatures at somewhere between 2 and 4 million. Within the first week, not professional military analysts, not government scientists, regular members of the population who had, apparently, decided on their own that this was an interesting problem worth spending their time on. Subcommander Kell brought the estimate to Volume 50 on day 9. He read it twice. Hobbyists, she said, and the word came out sounding very strange. That is the closest translation our matrix can give for how the population is classifying itself. They are doing this as a hobby. For interest, Volume 50 put the report down. How many do they have in their dedicated military and intelligence apparatus? Currently, based on our readings, approximately 11 million active military personnel globally, with significant intelligence infrastructure. But, sir, she stopped. He waited. The hobbyists are outperforming the official apparatus in several areas. They're sharing analysis faster. Their collective error correction is, we think they're getting closer to a working model of our communication encryption than our own predictions said was possible for a Class 3 species within the first month. Volume 50 was quiet for a moment. Within the first month, he said, "They're day 9, sir." He stood and walked to the viewport and looked at the blue planet for a very long time. Below him, 4 million amateurs were doing better intelligence work than his own professionals had predicted possible on the tightest timeline. Not because they had superior technology. Because, and this was the part his mind kept sliding off of, the part that didn't fit any model he owned, because they appear to find it genuinely interesting. The problem of figuring out the Velhari wasn't a duty or a survival imperative. It was, for an enormous portion of the population, fun. He thought of the ancient warning, the oracle, the 7 words, two-legged storm. He was beginning to understand the naming logic. A storm wasn't threatening because it was angry. It wasn't threatening because it wanted to destroy you. A storm was threatening because the conditions that produced it were the same conditions it thrived in. You couldn't reason with a storm. You couldn't wound one. You couldn't make it feel the weight of the threat you were posing to it. You could only ride it out. Or not. The first direct exchange happened on day 11, in the southeastern region of the landmass the creatures called Asia, near a city they called Seoul. Ground Unit 14 had established a perimeter around what their assessments identified as a significant regional resource processing facility, a refinery in the local parlance. Standard procedure: control the resource infrastructure, demonstrate capability, accelerate submission psychology. The perimeter had been established without incident. The Velhari soldiers had taken their positions. The civilian population had observed from the required distance. Everything was proceeding correctly. Then, a single two-legged creature walked up to the edge of the perimeter. She was small, even by the species standards. The unit commander later described her as elderly, wearing some kind of reflective thermal covering over her primary garments, carrying a sealed container of liquid and a flat disc of what we later determined was baked grain product. She walked directly to the nearest Velhari soldier and held out the container and the disc. The soldier looked at his unit commander. The unit commander looked at his chain of command. No protocol covered this exact situation. The elderly woman stood there, holding out the food and the drink with the patient stillness of someone who was confident the other party would eventually make a sensible decision. The soldier, after 40 seconds, took the items. The woman nodded as if this were the expected outcome and walked back to the observation line. This event, which seemed like nothing, was recorded by approximately 2,000 devices and distributed across the planet's communication network within 7 minutes. By the end of that day, it had been viewed by a number that Velhari intelligence officers, when they identified and mapped it, couldn't immediately decide what to do with, for 100 million. 400 million individual creatures, viewing a 3-minute video of an old woman giving a soldier some food. Why? Volume 50 said, when Kell brought him this number. We believe, Kell said carefully, that they are establishing something, a social record. They appear to have a strong cultural mechanism around bearing witness to moments of connection. They document those moments specifically and share them specifically, and the sharing appears to have a function similar to what we would call a binding agent. It binds the population together around a shared moment. Volume 50 stared at her. An invasion is a shared moment, he said. Yes, sir. They're using our invasion to bind themselves together. Yes, sir. That appears to be what is happening. He turned back to the viewport. Below him, the blue planet sat in its unremarkable orbit, doing nothing that looked dangerous, and yet every report on his desk suggested that the exact opposite of Velsora was occurring. The target civilization was not softening. It was knitting, pulling itself together with the shared experience of being invaded as the thread. He had never seen this before. He had seen populations fracture under the pressure of an integration event. He had seen governments collapse, resistance movements splinter, civilian cooperation with the Dominion spike as factions competed to offer more favorable submission terms. He had seen populations paralyzed with fear or rage without coordination or exhaust themselves with internal disagreement. He had never seen a population look at 40,000 ships in orbit and become more themselves. On day 14, Dr. Yel Ofer made a decision that was not in any first contact protocol her division had ever drafted, because no first contact protocol had ever been drafted under the assumption that contact would begin with the other party announcing they were about to take over. She made contact with the Velhari, not through the channels they provided, not through the submission protocol. She made contact through the research station in Chile, the one with Dr. Rendon's modified receiver array, using a transmission built not on the Velhari's mathematical framework, but on a different one entirely. A team of her division's linguists had spent 12 days constructing from scratch, using what they'd learned from monitoring Velhari internal communications. She did not submit. She did not defy. She asked a question. The question, in the Velhari mathematical language, translated to, "What is the thing you do not know about us yet?" It was the most dangerous question she could have asked, and she knew it, and she asked it anyway. It took Volume 54 hours to respond. His response was everything. She smiled when her team rendered it. Just for a second, the small, private smile of someone who has been hoping the opponent would be honest. Her return message, asterisk, that is correct. That is the problem. We're going to show you. Asterisk 2 days later, the first human military response began. And it was not what anyone's tactical computer predicted. The Velhari had modeled human military response extensively during the first 2 weeks. Orbital defenses, none. Missile launches, possible, but the yield capacity was assessed as insufficient to threaten fleet-scale assets. Direct ground engagement against Velhari soldiers, possible, but unfavorable given the technology gap. Guerrilla tactics, likely in the medium to long term, manageable. What actually happened on day 16 was that humanity simultaneously did all of those things and 12 others. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Vol's orbital watch commanders called in 7 contacts in the first hour. A missile battery in the Central Asian landmass launched 14 warheads. Not at the fleet, but at the communications relay drone the Velhari had placed in geosynchronous orbit. A target so specific it told Vol's intelligence people that someone had mapped the fleet's infrastructure in detail and chosen the single highest value soft target. The missiles were destroyed before impact, but the targeting data they demonstrated was worse news than the missiles themselves. Simultaneously, in 3 coastal cities, the Velhari ground units found themselves unable to move. Not because anything was blocking them physically, because the 2-legged creatures had surrounded them so completely, so densely, so peacefully, with such comprehensive recording infrastructure, that any use of force against the crowd would be documented in real time from 40,000 angles and distributed globally in minutes. Moving through the crowd would require moving through the crowd. Velhari soldiers were not trained for this problem. It wasn't a problem that existed in their tactical libraries. Crowd management existed, but deliberate weaponized peaceful witness did not have a doctrine page. While that was happening, the creature's information warfare division, and here Vol's intelligence officer's voice went very flat and careful when she presented it, had spent 2 weeks building a detailed signal intelligence map of Velhari communications encryption by running the traffic through what the translation matrix kept describing as community puzzle-solving events distributed across the planetary network. Meaning, they had turned cracking Velhari military encryption into a publicly available game, and somewhere between 3 and 6 million creatures had played it. They had cracked a 94th generation Velhari encryption schema in 16 days. The intelligence officer presenting this information paused for a long time after that sentence. Fudd waited. The Accord average for a Class 5 species, our most advanced designations, is 40 to 60 days with dedicated institutional resources, she said. How many days for Class 3? There is no Class 3 data point, she said quietly. No Class 3 species has ever attempted it. Below him, the planet sat there, blue and white and green. And he understood, finally, with the clarity of a man who had spent 2 weeks refusing to understand something, what the Oracle had been describing. Not a species that had once been dangerous and was now sleeping. A species that was only ever partially deployed. That existed in peace in a state of fractional output. That had built its whole civilization on the edge of capabilities it hadn't needed to use yet. And the waking wasn't them getting up. The waking was them deciding to try. He thought of the 4 million hobbyists, the old woman and the food, the missile targeting data, the encryption crack, the weaponized, peaceful witness. None of it was their full capacity. He could feel it, the way you can feel a storm before it arrives, not from the rain, not from the wind, but from the change in pressure. The way the air gets heavy and starts to mean something. He pressed his comm. Give me a channel to the surface. Direct. I will speak with whatever authority structure they have delegated to this. Cal responded in 2 seconds. Sir, Dr. Ofer is already on the line. She has been waiting since this morning. He stared at the comm panel. She had been waiting. She had known he would call. He accepted the channel. The voice that came through was calm, slightly tired, with the accent of a person who had spent a long time working in buildings with no windows. Not a military voice. Not a political voice. A scientist's voice. High Commander Volume 50, Dr. Ofer said. I've been looking forward to talking properly. He said, How did you know my name? Your communication patterns, she said. Hierarchical authority structures have a specific signature in their traffic routing. We identified your node on day 4. Day 4. You've been listening to us, he said. We've been learning, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet. She let the silence sit, which was itself information. She was comfortable with silence in a negotiation, which meant she didn't need him to fill it, which meant she was not in a desperate position. What do you want, Dr. Ofer, he said. Right now. Her voice carried something he could not fully read through the translation matrix. I want you to understand what's happening. Not what you think is happening. What is actually happening? Because you're making decisions based on incomplete information, and those decisions are going to go very badly for your people, and I would like to give you the chance to make better ones. He sat in his chair aboard the Eternal Dominion with 40,000 ships behind him and looked at a blue planet and listened to a small woman with a tired voice tell him he was making mistakes. Tell me, he said. You landed, she said. That's mistake 1. You treated us as a resource target before you treated us as a civilization. That's mistake 2. You assumed that 48 hours was enough time for a species to decide its own fate. That's mistake 3. A pause. The thing about mistakes 1, 2, and 3 is that they're all recoverable. They're embarrassing, but recoverable. He waited. Mistake 4, she said, is if you stay. If you continue phase 2. If you push further. Another pause. That one is not recoverable. Not for you. The silence after that was very long. You're threatening me, he said. No, she said. I'm not. I am telling you that in 20 years of working in this field, I have studied every contact event in the Galactic Accord's record. I have read the archived warnings. And the thing that every civilization that ever encountered humanity failed to understand is that we don't respond to threats the way the threat maker expects. You respond how? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, she sounded almost gentle. The way you sound when you're about to say something that is true and difficult, and that you're not happy about being the one to say. When you threaten something that has nothing to lose, she said, it doesn't calculate odds. It doesn't assess survival probability. It commits. A beat. Your oracle was correct. We were sleeping. But a sleeping storm is still a storm. All the sleeping means is that the full system hasn't engaged yet. He looked at the planet. What is the full system, he said. That's what I'm trying to help you not find out, she said. And for the first time in 31 integrations, High Commander Sereth Volume 50 of the Velhari Dominion had nothing to say. The conversation between High Commander Volume 50 and Dr. Yel Ofer lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. The Velhari Intelligence Division recorded every second. 2 translators worked in shifts. A behavioral analyst was brought in halfway through and spent the second half of the call trying to annotate what she was hearing in real time, which proved functionally impossible because the behavioral model she was using had been built for species the Velhari had met before, and this woman did not fit anywhere in it. She was not performing weakness. She was not stalling. She was not making promises she intended to break later, which was the most common tactic deployed by desperate leadership in late Phase 2 conditions. She was explaining, genuinely and without apparent agenda, explaining, as if the most important thing in this moment with 40,000 ships in orbit above her world was that he understands something correctly. The behavioral analyst wrote in her notes, Asterisk subject appears to believe that information, properly conveyed, changes outcomes. Subject appears to believe this with a sincerity that suggests it has worked for her before. Recommend caution. This may indicate the subject has a longer game strategy we cannot currently model, or it may indicate the subject's civilization has a relationship to truth-telling that does not match our baseline assumptions about intelligent species under threat. Asterisk, she underlined the last part 3 times and then stared at her own underlines for a while. At the end of the 4 hours, Volume 50 told Dr. Ofer he would consider what she'd said and recontact in 24 hours. She said, 24 hours is fine, but I want to be honest with you about what 24 hours means from our side. He said, tell me. She said, it means 24 more hours of what we've been doing for the last 2 weeks, which is a lot. He requested a full intelligence briefing immediately after closing the channel. He sat in the briefing room and listened to his people for 3 hours, and at the end of the 3 hours, he had a headache that he suspected was philosophical in origin. The summary, stripped of everything but the essential. In 16 days, the target population had cracked Velhari military encryption, mapped the fleet's infrastructure vulnerability points, identified and begun countering the specific psychological operations tools the Velhari Communications Division was deploying through captured broadcast channels, developed a working theoretical model of Velhari propulsion technology based on atmospheric wake signatures from landing craft, established a comprehensive signal intelligence network that was monitoring Velhari ship-to-ship communication in real time, and in what the intelligence officer described as the most confusing development in my professional career, launched a globally coordinated campaign through their information network to study the 17 alien civilizations currently under Velhari control and establish. The intelligence officer paused for the word diplomatic contact with the absorbed populations behind Velhari administrative backs. They're trying to build a coalition, Kell said when the briefing ended and they were alone. Of what? Volume 50 said. Of everything the Dominion has ever absorbed, she said. They are reaching out from a planet under Phase 2 integration with no interstellar communication infrastructure to civilizations on the other side of the Accord who have been under Dominion administration for between 100 and 800 years, and they're doing it by reverse engineering our own relay network. She stopped. Some of the absorbed civilizations are responding. Volume 50 thought about this. The storm was not just defending its own planet. While being invaded, while under direct military occupation, while managing 8 billion people's worth of population-level crisis, it had looked at the broader situation and decided that the appropriate move was to start working on the larger problem. His headache deepened. What is the combat assessment? He said. The intelligence officer who answered had the look of someone who had spent the last 6 hours staring at data she didn't want to present. If we escalate to direct military engagement, full force, orbital strike capacity, ground assault, we assess a high probability of successfully suppressing surface resistance within 3 to 6 months. She stopped. He waited. With what remaining force capacity? He said. She said, 40 to 50% of current assets. The room was very quiet. They have no orbital capability, he said. No energy shields. No efficacy. They have primitive surface-to-orbit missiles that we've already demonstrated we can intercept. How are we losing 50 to 60% of 40,000 ships to a Class 3 species? She pulled up the assessment. He read it. Nuclear. Mass deployment. Not the clumsy, threatening nuclear of a species that was hoping the weapons served as a deterrent. The kind of nuclear that a species deployed when it had decided that losing was acceptable as long as what it was defending against lost more. Submarine platforms surfacing simultaneously in every ocean on the planet. Ground-based intercontinental systems launching coordinated salvos designed not to penetrate the fleet's point defense one at a time, but to saturate it in volumes that even 40,000 ships couldn't absorb cleanly. Deep bunker manufacturing infrastructure. And here was the part that made the assessment genuinely alarming. That the population had apparently been building out and stocking for 11 days which meant they had started preparing for the possibility of full military escalation on day 5, which meant on day 5 they had already wargamed this scenario to its conclusion and had gotten comfortable with what they found there. A species that had looked at the math of its own potential military defeat and decided to continue anyway was not a species you fought the normal way. The normal way assumed the opponent would optimize for survival. The normal way assumed there was a point past which the opponent would choose its own continuation over whatever it was defending. This species did not appear to have that point. Or rather, it had that point. It just had a very specific location. The location was after the last one of them was dead. Do they know the assessment? Volume 50 asked. Yes, his intelligence officer said. We believe they ran the same numbers. And they're continuing. Yes, sir. He sat with that. 24 hours later, he called Dr. Ofer back. She picked up on the second signal. Alert. Present. He suspected she hadn't slept, but her voice gave nothing away. Hi, Commander, she said. I've been reading your history, he said. A pause. Which part? The war records. She was quiet for a moment. I see. You have fought each other, he said. Extensively. You have fought each other for territory, for ideology, for religion, for resources that weren't worth the cost of fighting for them. You have fought each other while starving. You have fought each other across weapons gaps that should have made the outcome obvious from the beginning. You have fought each other in situations where everyone's survival model said to surrender, and you didn't. Yes, she said. Why, he said. It was not a question about tactics. He was a man who understood tactics. It was a question about something underneath the tactics that he didn't have a framework for. She thought about it for a long time. He could hear her breathing. I don't know if I can give you an answer that translates, she said. But I'll try. She tried. She talked for 20 minutes. He listened. She talked about something his translation matrix kept rendering as momentum, the way that a civilization which has survived its own worst impulses develops a specific relationship to continuation. Not optimism. She was careful to say it wasn't optimism. Not faith in good outcomes. Something more like the muscle memory of still being here after all the times you almost weren't. The practiced, bone-deep reflex of continuing. Not because the odds were good. Not because it made logical sense. Because continuing was what you did. Because stopping was a different thing entirely, and you had decided a very long time ago at the species level that stopping was not in the available option set. We have a saying, she said. Several, actually. But the one I keep coming back to is the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. A pause. We have been planting trees for a very long time. High Commander. Some of those trees are 30 years old. Some are 300. We plant them even when we don't know if we'll be there to see them grow. We plant them especially then. He thought about that. The coalition you're building, he said, with the absorbed civilizations. You know that will take decades to matter, even if it works. Yes, she said. You started on day 4. Yes. While being invaded. The invasion didn't change the timeline, she said. It just made the timeline more urgent. He sat in the silence for a moment. What do you actually want, Dr. Ofer, he said. Not from this conversation. From this. He meant the whole thing. The occupation. The fleet. The situation. She answered without hesitating, which told him she had been thinking about this answer for a while. I want you to leave, she said. I want you to go back to the Dominion Council and tell them what you found here. Not what your assessments predicted. What you actually found. And then I want the Dominion to make a different kind of decision than it's ever made before. What decision? Whether it wants a neighbor, she said, or an enemy. He thought about the word neighbor. He did not think he had used that word in a professional context in 30 years of military service. The cost of making an enemy of us, she said, is something your archive already tried to tell you. But you only had 7 words. Let me give you more. She paused, and in that pause he could hear her gathering something. Not bravado, not threat. The particular quality of someone stating a plain fact they are not happy about, but are too honest to omit. We have been fighting things bigger than ourselves for the entire duration of our recorded history. Ice ages, plagues, each other. Every single time, something has survived and rebuilt and tried again. We don't know how to stop. We don't have the biology for it. You landed on a planet of 8 billion creatures that individually would rather not die, but collectively have already decided that continuation at any cost is the one non-negotiable. You can't integrate that. You can't administer it. You can't soften it. The only thing you can do with something like that is decide what relationship you want to have with it. The silence after that was very long. You said you were sleeping, he said. We were, she said. What does awake look like? She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, you don't want to know? That's the whole point of the warning. Volume 50 went back to the Dominion Council. He took his full intelligence briefing, all 17 days of accumulated data, and the recording of the call, and he presented it in its entirety without omission or framing, a thing he had never done before. Intelligence briefings were always shaped. You emphasized the actionable and minimized the alarming. You built toward the conclusion you had already reached. He built toward nothing. He just put it in front of them. The council chamber was silent for a long time after. The first secretary finally said, "What is your recommendation?" He said, "Withdrawal. Full. No administrative presence. No resource extraction agreements. No integration attempts." Another silence. And after withdrawal, the first secretary said, Volume 50 thought about the old woman with the food and the container of liquid, the 4 million hobbyists, the encryption crack on day 16, the coalition letters traveling through reverse-engineered Velhari relay systems to civilizations under Dominion administration on the other side of the Accord. The trees Dr. Ofer said they'd been planting for 300 years. After withdrawal, he said, "We decide if we want a neighbor." The withdrawal took 11 days. It was orderly. No shots fired in either direction. The Velhari ground units moved back to their landing craft, and the landing craft moved back to the fleet, and the fleet began the long pull away from the blue planet's gravity well. The populations of the landing sites watched the whole thing. They recorded it. They did not cheer, or rather, some of them did in some locations, but it was mixed with something more complicated, the way human reactions always seem to be mixed with something more complicated than whatever you expected. Dr. Ofer watched the last of the ships pull out of low orbit from the window of a very boring government building in Geneva on a gray afternoon, with a cup of cold coffee in her hand that she had forgotten was cold. Her assistant came in and said they're gone from sensor range. She nodded. "What now?" he said. She thought about it. "Now we keep doing what we were already doing," she said. "The coalition work. The archived warning deconstruction. I want to know who wrote that 7-word record and what they knew. And get the Chile team back on the receiver array. I want to monitor Velhari internal communications for the next 12 months at minimum." She turned from the window. "And tell the tree planting people they can expand the program." He looked uncertain. "The tree planting people? Global Reforestation Initiative," she said. "We paused the expansion when this started. We can restart it now." She took a sip of her cold coffee without noticing it was cold. "We've got time." The 17 Velhari survivors, the ones who had been close enough to the early ground deployments to experience the full texture of what had happened, were not debriefed in the usual way. The council brought in a special panel, academic, behavioral, multidisciplinary. One of the panel members asked a survivor, a young lieutenant who had been part of Ground Unit 14, about the old woman with the food, the moment that had been watched by 400 million people in one day. "Why do you think she did it?" the panel member asked. The lieutenant thought about it for a long time. "We were frightening," she said. "We were supposed to be frightening. Everything about Phase 2 is designed to be frightening. The ships, the soldiers, the equipment." And she just walked up anyway, with bread and something warm to drink. She paused. "I thought about it a lot on the way back. What that meant. For a long time, I thought it meant she wasn't afraid. And now," the panel member said. "Now I think she was afraid," the lieutenant said. "I think she was very afraid. And she walked up anyway, because she'd already decided that being afraid wasn't a good enough reason not to." She paused again. "That's more frightening, actually." The panel member wrote that down. Then he thought about the oracle. 3,000 years old. 7 words. Filed by someone who had seen whatever there was to see and came back and wrote it down, and never explained it. Do not wake the two-legged storm. He thought about storms, the conditions that produce them, the way a storm doesn't threaten. It doesn't plan. It doesn't calculate. It just becomes. When the pressure is right and the temperature is right and all the constituent parts that were always there anyway finally move into the configuration that lets the whole system engage. The creatures on the blue planet had been all the constituent parts, whole time. The Velhari had been the pressure change. He closed his notebook. Somewhere on a blue planet, in a cold gray city, a woman with cold coffee was running a coalition and restarting a reforestation program and pointing a modified receiver array at the sky. Still watching, still planting, still here. The storm didn't go back to sleep. It just got comfortable with knowing it was awake.